This is Sirens, a new series brought to you by the ladies of Bombshell, where we dissect the institutions of American power. Join us as we sound the alarm on technology, governance, and national security issues, and maybe lure some men to their deaths. This week, Lauren and Rada sat down with Valerie Insinna, a reporter with Breaking Defense, and a longtime Pentagon Press Corps member, to discuss recent events in the Pentagon Press Corps and what makes the overall Pentagon Press Corps unique. We've been mentioning over the past several weeks various things that are going on between Secretary Hegseth, the media, the increasingly hostile or tense or stressful or kind of bizarre relationship that we are seeing going on between the press and the Department of Defense, or actually now Department of War, which how do you even say that? DOW? Like, that's just like a ridiculous acronym. And we wanted to spend some time with an amazing longtime friend of the show, friend of ours, who has been spending a lot of her career working on covering the Department of Defense, the military, the industrial base, and many things related to this, and talk through what does this mean not only for like the near term in terms of the relationship between the Department of Defense and the media that covers it, but also what does it mean for democracy, our institutions, and the ability to hold the Department of Defense accountable based on what a democratic military should look like. So we are just so excited to welcome Valerie Insinna, who is a congressional and industry reporter with Breaking Defense, back to the show. I say back to the show because prior Bombshell guest, delighted to have her back in this conversation. And for today, we want to kick off with a first question for you, Val, which is a really basic one that you have experience with. Of like, let's think about the before times when you had a Pentagon badge. Tell us what you would describe as a typical, if there is one, day in the life of a Pentagon reporter. Do you just like wander around the Pentagon and like run into the Secretary of Defense in the hallway? Do you meet the chairman for lunch? Do you get lost like everybody else? What's that like?
Definitely get lost. Less though meeting the chairman for lunch. That would be cool. But, sadly, most of the time the chairman and the secretary, they're not going down to Popeyes in the food court to pick up a chicken sandwich the way that I would.
They
Um,
absolutely should, though. No question.
they should.
Hmm.
I think it would improve their day, but maybe not like the whole physical fitness sort of thing. So yeah, a typical day. So I think to give your listeners sort of a picture of where the press usually works out of, there are two bullpens and then a bunch of video booths that are located next to the Pentagon briefing room. So there's this sort of like enclave for the press. And next to that where all of the OSD, the Office of Secretary of Defense, public affairs people kind of all sit. So during a typical day, I'd be at one of those desks in the bullpen, and I'd be doing interviews. I'd be writing my stories. A lot of times I would walk over to the PAOs for OSD, or I would venture around to the service PAOs. They're located in different offices around the building. Sometimes it's because, I wanted a question answered. Sometimes it's just because I like to chat. I'm a gabber. And so, you just stop by Air Force public affairs and annoy them until they tell me to go away, and bother them with questions about, did you see this television show or whatever else? So I think one thing in this whole discussion that's kind of been mischaracterized a little bit is the amount of access that Pentagon reporters have. We have access to all of the unclassified spaces in the Pentagon.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, we have a similar level of movement as the guys working at Starbucks or like the janitors, but those people actually have way more access than we do because the janitors can like go into certain offices that we cannot get into. I can't get into a skip. I don't have a key to get into every single office. I'm not knocking on doors trying to get random people to open up. Basically, I do have freedom of movement in the hallways, or I did. So sometimes like I would walk around with other reporters or with people that I knew in the building just to stretch my legs and to chat. But yeah, like I think people think that it kind of operates similar to Capitol Hill, where
Yeah.
if you see a lawmaker, you can just come up to them and like ask them a question and they can choose whether or not to engage with you. You will sometimes run into senior leaders in the Pentagon, but sort of the guidance is that you can say hello, you can chat with them, but if you run into, the secretary in the hallway, you shouldn't be like bombarding him to try to get a quote for something. And most senior leaders would not be responsive if you were to do such a thing. But, I've seen, the former Chief Master Sergeant of the Air Force while I was like taking free Girl Scout cookies that were available and had a nice little chat with her one day about our favorite Girl Scout cookies. But, I didn't turn around and be like, okay, so
Obviously.
tell me about this thing.
Also, what's similar to the scandal. So, one of the things that was striking to me, I mean, Rada and I have both worked in the Pentagon before, as has Aaron. And I moved on. I worked at the National Security Council, Office of Management Budget. Rada has worked there as well as Department of Energy. But it didn't strike me until I had left how the Pentagon press corps, despite what you're talking about in terms of like access and wandering the hallways, it's still pretty unique in terms of the relationship that DoD has with the media in some ways, not in all ways, but in some ways, maybe just in terms of like scope or size. But I would love to hear from your perspective, just historically, what has made that relationship unique? And have there been any sort of changes or inflection points or practices that have really shaped that relationship?
So, I think no, journalists working at other departments do not have as much access as we had in the Pentagon. It's been that way since the Eisenhower administration. I think that's one of the reasons that I became so attracted to working in the Pentagon and wanted to stay working in defense from the time that I was, a baby reporter that was essentially, like, I was an editorial assistant at a Japanese
Hmm.
newspaper who had a bureau in DC. And my bosses would send me to cover the Pentagon gaggles during the Obama administration. And what stuck out to me is like how kind people were and like the
Yeah.
level of expertise, um, both within the core of journalists as well as, obviously the military and civilian professionals that, you know, run the building essentially. I think unlike other departments where people turn over politically, you do have that in the Department of Defense, but you also have this core group of civilians and of uniformed military people that are just either there constantly or they rotate in and out. And that means that over time you build a very, very strong relationship amongst those people, whether you're a journalist or whether you're a part of the building itself. So as a journalist that started covering the Pentagon in my earlier mid 20s, I started forming relationships with majors, captains, colonels. And then over my career, I've seen them grow in rank. And what really happens is you're able to build this trust that lasts years or sometimes decades, um, that I think is like very, very unique. Like, this is a place with
Yeah.
a very long institutional memory. Uh, a lot of journalists, that are older than me, they've, gone to active war zones, embedded with the military. They've been hurt while doing those embeds. They were here on 9/11 in the Pentagon, and they covered what happened that day, and they knew people that died. So I think that is a really special thing, and I think everyone that works here understands how special it is to be a part of that and really approaches our work with a sense of care and understanding of the gravity of it.
Yeah, I mean, kind of to Lauren's point, obviously, I have spent a good amount of time at the Pentagon, and it's not to say there isn't the normal tensions that come from reporters, being trying to seek stories, but there is a different kind of mutual respect of what everyone is doing there that has really spanned a number of different administrations and parties and time. And before we get to the most recent events, maybe it's just helpful for context to take a second and sort of, since the change in administration, so prior to this, newest set of things that reporters were asked to sign, how have things been different this year, overall, or have they been different? Was this sort of change out of the blue, or has there been a sense of an end of that kind of special type of relationship?
I think that it was a pretty dramatic change from the get-go. Broadly speaking, I think there's always been certain norms that were preserved in the past, even within the first Trump administration. There would be pretty frequent briefings, either on camera or off. There would be, you would have journalists go on trips. There was just traditions that were kind of upheld of, you know, certain news networks had their spaces for filming. Since coming in, I think Hegseth and his team has made it pretty clear that they don't really understand or respect the work that we do as journalists. Um, you know, Very quickly after coming in, they kicked out, a couple of media outlets from their desks. And when the Pentagon Press Association, approached the administration and asked them to reconsider the situation, they basically doubled down and said, "Thanks for your input," instead of, this amount of people or this amount of outlets that were going to demand that they leave their spots. We're actually doubling that number. And they, for the most part, replaced those like long held spots with right wing news outlets. And then, months later, they announced new restrictions about where the reporters could actually go within the building. And again, to restate, like to begin with, we were not allowed to go in any sort of classified area, or, we did not have access to certain offices. But now we're restricted to a point where we can really only go to OSD Public Affairs and the cafeteria. We don't even have the ability to walk over to Army Public Affairs or Navy Public Affairs or Air Force Public Affairs, which is, really, really unfortunate. And then in September, we got this new requirement to be able to keep our badges. We had to sign this agreement. I think on top of that, just the way that the administration talks about the media, the way that the department leadership talks about the media is very different from in the past. It's very combative. I don't think we've ever seen that in the past. There's almost a lack of professionalism in some cases. Like, I think everyone saw Hegseth calling out Jen Griffith from Fox, who's someone that has a ton of respect, no matter whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, that's someone that is sort of known for shooting straight. So I think that is telling for just the overall level of the relationship and how that's changed, I suppose.
I was going to say you mentioned the agreement you all asked to sign, and so just to lay out bare facts, can you just lay out a little bit here's what you're asked to sign, but I think somewhat more importantly, most of us are not journalists who are listening to this episode. Why was that antithetical to how both you and the broader Pentagon press corps approach your roles? And why did I think more or less as a body, the large papers in the defense trays, they chose not to sign this agreement and walked away. So just love to hear a little bit more about that, and then we can get more into the so how does this work now? What world are we in at this point?
Yeah, yeah. So essentially, the department gave us a 21-page document, which was very different than the single page document that we had to sign in the past to get a badge. I kind of want to debunk two myths that I think the administration kind of keeps talking about. We already, had to wear our Pentagon badges every time we were in the building. have them visible above our, on our chest. So we were already doing that. That was not an issue for us. And in terms of the other thing that they keep talking about is we wanted unfettered access to the building. Again, we wanted to just retain the access that we already have. We weren't looking to try to get into classified areas. We understand that those areas need to be kept for classified information. The big issue was that there was language in there that essentially kind of criminalized talking to reporters. Basically said that anyone in the Defense Department needed to have formal permission to talk to a reporter, and if they didn't have that permission, they were committing some sort of criminal act. And it implied that any reporter that tried to solicit information, even if it was trying to get information that was unclassified, hey, anything, if you know anything about this, like send me an email. You can reach me on Signal. That could be seen as trying to solicit classified or sensitive information, and that we could be kicked out of the Pentagon or potentially even legally prosecuted. So there were really serious concerns among the lawyers of all of the news organizations that we could potentially open ourselves up to criminal charges by signing this document and saying that we understand what DOD is saying to be true. So, only 2 reporters out of the 110 members of the Pentagon Press Association
Wow.
signed the new agreement. It was an Indian freelancer and the reporter for OAN. But I think it's really also important to note that there are tons of conservative media outlets that said, no, we can't do this. Like our lawyers say we cannot do this, from like Fox News, Washington Times, Newsmax. They all took a look at this and they're like, nope, this is not something we're willing to do because it just opens us up to litigation potentially.
Mm-hmm. What they've effectively done in this agreement is make the very act of journalism of just like asking additional questions and just saying like, what else should I know about that? Tell me more about this. Who might I talk to about this? Basically, like the First Amendment in practice, if not criminalizing, then lending it the risk of a criminalization towards it in a way that is both a huge chilling effect on like the journalists who are in the Pentagon, who are already there in very sort of different sorts of ways you might expect to be in other sorts of kinds of coverage, but also those who are doing their like setting aside like me coming to you and saying like, hey, I have concerns about this, I'm going to share this unclassified information with you, and I'm going to do so in a way that like maybe is not my job, going to do it anyway. But to me, it also potentially criminalizes people who are literally just doing their public affairs jobs of I'm going to share this information with you, but then somebody gets mad about it after the fact, which happens, let's be real, that happens a lot in day-to-day journalism of like, I'm going to share this official information with you, and then like later on people are unhappy about it.
Coming from the journalist side of things, like we don't know whether something is classified or not. Also, because we're not reading all
also
this
not
stuff.
your job.
And there are like times, that I've been told by sources like, this, piece of information A might be unclassified and piece of information B might be unclassified, but if you put them together, they could be classified. And that sort of like that puts us in a tricky spot, because it's like, what if we inadvertently ask about something classified or write something that is sensitive or classified without even knowing it, but we've signed this agreement. So again, the fear of litigation is real.
Which happens all the time in the national security context, where like there are ways to talk about things, combinations of information, people pairing different sorts of insights together that, don't get me wrong, are sensitive in and of themselves, but are like, it's just a really complex thing to help navigate without that kind of relationship that we're talking about.
And like just to build on that point and then maybe turn to a question for you, Val, it's like I think part of the value of the relationship between public affairs officers and journalists is to be able to have those conversations when you need to have them, which is like, hey, that's really sensitive. We're worried about risk to personnel, or this is a critical news story. People should know, you can have those when you build the level of conversation between the media and journalists. So maybe a place to start, I do want to think about what the future looks like, but maybe the starting point and maybe motivator for our listeners, why do we want or need a strong and independent Pentagon press corps? Like what is the, we've talked about how it was the norm until recently. What do you see the sort of real value there in for the American people and for governance maybe more generally?
Yeah, I mean, I think you need it to tell the real story of the Defense Department and the US military to its stakeholders and to the public, for good or for ill. Sometimes that means I get to break stories about how the US Air Force is the, first branch of the military in the entire world that has a sixth generation fighter, and that's really freaking cool. And then sometimes it means that we're going to have to report on military leaders that abused their position or wasted taxpayer dollars. I think what's important is that good journalism could lead to positive changes, maybe because Congress starts paying attention to an issue, or maybe a good leader sees something that was negatively impacting service members and they decide to change the policy. But I think like everyone understands this, whether you're on the left or the right. The government is not incentivized to tell on itself, no matter which party is in charge, right? So it sometimes takes journalists to shed light on how bad a situation is getting. I think we saw that, a couple of years ago with the Afghanistan withdrawal. Unfortunately, we saw it, years and years ago, decades ago with Vietnam. So I think that's really, really important. But I think we're also important in terms of telling the story of the US military and its people and its culture to the public. I think in DC, we take for granted that there are tons of people throughout this country that do not have service members in their family, or they don't really have anyone close to them that has served. And so, being a journalist that works in this world, we get to spotlight incredible people from various walks of life who are giving their lives and their talent to the military. And we get to humanize them by, writing about their lives or sometimes really stupid things like just very weird aspects of military culture or like pilots flying around in the shape of a dick and like, like
Which happens kind of all the time, apparently.
Yeah.
It happens more than you would guess, I think. But like these are just
I don't know. Two
these
boys.
stupid things like help the public understand the military. It helps humanize the military. I think it's important. I think it's kind of like a net good for the department, even if the stories are sometimes not good in the moment.
Like this is one of those things where the Department of Defense, on behalf of the American people, spends like $1 trillion, like on any number of different things, personnel, platforms, services, and so much more for military families. And at the same time is asking service members to risk their lives on behalf of Americans in ways they know about, ways they don't know about. And I think there's just an enormous risk of that becoming so mysterious and so secret that those are not worth it to Americans anymore. Like I think there's a kind of a middle gray space of people kind of enjoying the mysteriousness, and then I think there's like a big space after that and saying like, I don't understand what you do for me here. All I ever hear about is bad news, as opposed to hearing about the opportunity, the challenges, the risks that they take on, in addition to the transparency that comes with that. So you're so right in highlighting that as the good and the bad is a part of the game here. And we are, by requesting this much of Americans, the transparency is owed to them.
And I think maybe in that vein, and kind of to wrap us here, like we've got a really basically entirely new Pentagon press corps with a new group of organizations. You've got people reading a really different kind of set of outputs from both the traditional reporters who are reporting from outside and from the new reporters inside. So what kind of, where do you see that, where do you think this leaves us in terms of long-term implications for accountability, in terms of the quality of reporting folks can do from outside the building, in terms of the folks that are inside, kind of help paint a picture of what we could see and what we should look out for in the coming months and years?
Yeah, I think that those of us that have left the building, we might not be there anymore, but we haven't stopped reporting, and we're still going to keep going and still going to be chasing stories. I mean, just last week, I got a scoop about how Hegseth had issued a memo basically directing everyone in DoD that if they were going to talk to the Hill, it has to go through like the main Ledge Affairs office first. And the folks that I talked to were very concerned that this is going to shut off the flow of information to Congress or slow things down or just, you know, potentially impede Congress from getting the information that it needs. But I mean, things are still going to leak out. You know, those of us that have done this reporting for years, I think we still have our sources. I think what's going to happen is that things are going to move slower because we're going to have to, you know, meet with people outside of the building. It's just going to take more time and effort. And I think, you know, sadly, the thing that really makes me upset is that the younger reporters are not going to have the opportunity that I had to make these really strong connections with uniformed PIOs. And that's really important for understanding the culture of the military and of the Pentagon as a whole. So it's going to hurt our ability to like make those personal connections. I think that, there's still opportunity that they could reverse things if either this administration or the next administration wanted to do so. I hope that in the future, the department and their senior leadership sees value in having reporters in the Pentagon, having the reporters that have for decades been there coming back, and just understanding that, like, we genuinely care about the military and our job really matters to us, even if it sometimes leads to difficult conversations or difficult stories about things that the government wants to keep buried. So I don't know. I try to be as hopeful as I can that good journalism can still get done and that maybe at some point there's a way for us to come back.
I have so many fingers crossed that future comes to be. I learned so much from various Pentagon reporters like Bob Burns from AP, John Ismay from New York Times, Jennifer Griffith, you had mentioned. So much of what I came to believe about what is so important about our military came from reading them. Being in the building was one thing. Reading them gave me an entirely different perspective on so much of our work. Dan Lamott at Washington Post and our friend Aaron Mehta. So Valerie, thank you so much for joining us. I think this is a critical issue and we're going to come back to. I am deeply saddened that we are at this state with the Pentagon press corps, but frankly, really excited to see what everyone does from a different angle and different perspectives and have lots of confidence that we'll still get lots of the meat coming out to the American people. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. And yeah, if I could just say one last thing, if you care about this, keep talking to journalists. Don't share classified information with us. If you don't do that.
Unless it's really important.
Unless it's really important. But keep talking to us so that we can do our job and we can make sure that, we're holding leadership accountable and making sure that the stakeholders that need information are getting the information that they need.